Well, earlier today, Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina made it official. He's been teasing us for about a month now. But yes, it was official. He is, in fact, officially running for president. Here's what that sounded like and looked like.
Joe Biden and the radical left are attacking every single rung of the ladder that helped me climb. And that's why I'm announcing today that I'm running for president of the United States of America.
Here's the thing about Tim Scott. He's really like that. Absolutely genuine. Let's bring in another guy who's pretty genuine. He's the managing editor of our great Hot Air site, part of the Town Hall Media Complex and part of the Salem family. He's, of course, Ed Morrissey. Ed, he's a really enthusiastic guy, and he does bring a smile to your face, doesn't he?
He does, and it's very genuine, right? This is not it's not a put on. This is the way Tim Scott is. It's the way Tim Scott always has been. It's one of the reasons why, even though I'm kind of skeptical of his chances of advancing in a primary for other reasons, I think he's a big plus for the Republican Party to have him there, because I don't know that we're going to get a lot of optimism from Donald Trump. I don't even know that we're going to get a lot of optimism from Ron DeSantis. And certainly not going to hear it from Mike Pompeo or Chris Christie. So I think you need to have somebody up there who can frame the entire cycle in the way that Tim Scott does. I got to tell you, I thought that the very beginning of that rally was probably the best part of it, when he brings his mother up on stage, thanks her. And I forget who the other woman was, but he presents them both with roses. I mean, somebody who's obviously very personally important to him. I thought that this is a guy who really knows how to deliver that message of optimism and deliver the message that there are no limits except those that we place on ourselves.
In fact, let's focus on that part of his speech. We got another clip here, Ed, where he sort of lays out, it really does push back straight against what the left in the Democratic Party would have you think of this nation. Here, take a look.
But under Joe Biden, our nation is not a nation in decline. But under Joe Biden, we have become a nation in retreat, retreating from our heritage and our history, retreating from personal responsibility and hard work, retreating from strength and security, even retreating from religious liberty and the worship of God himself. They say opportunity in America is a myth, and faith in America is a fraud. But the truth of my life disproves their lies.
Yeah, that's a full frontal assault on the 1619 Project, on the equity pushers. And it's a great message from a great messenger, Ed, that really does sort of reinforce the fact that by pretty big growing numbers now, Black men are voting Republican in this country more so than they have in decades.
True, although still not necessarily in the numbers that will tilt an election. But this is a continuum, right? And so it's going to eventually get to that point, unless Democrats suddenly change their approach to this. Mm-hmm. I think that one of the big things that came out of this was that Tim Scott is going to oppose a culture of grievances and victimhood. And I think that has a certain subtext, right? For the Republican primary, there is a big split here amongst Republicans, whether or not this cycle is about the 2020 election or whether it's really about going forward after the 2024 election. You have one candidate in the race who is basing this his campaign not just on his own grievances and victimhood, although basically primarily on his own grievances and victimhood, but also sort of raising the idea of grievance and victimhood as a rallying cry for Republicans, sort of to compete, I think, against what the Democrats do.
Yeah.
And here you've got Tim Scott, who's really saying, no, we're not going to go that route. And I think Tim Scott really did frame this against Joe Biden and Republicans in terms of explicit framing for this right today. But I think that there's a big subtext here in that Tim Scott may be fighting in some sense for the Republican soul by getting them away from the grievance and victimhood type of thing, which allowed Trump to rally them in 2016. It was successful in 2016. I'm not saying it wasn't, but it was less successful in 2020. It was less successful in 2022.
Perhaps. I don't know if the 2016 message was victimhood and grievance. I would maybe take issue with that. Also, by the way, after seeing the Durham report, I think that President Trump personally has a pretty strong case to make that he was a victim.
I agree.
So, that said, though, what's interesting to me over the last several presidential elections, really for the last 20 years, there's always been that one candidate in the Republican Party who runs as the Christian values candidate. I'm thinking Rick Santorum. I'm thinking Mike Huckabee. And certainly in this case, with this statement, I think that Tim Scott might be actually trying to grab that wedge. Here, watch.
You see, they're attacking our American values, our schools, our economy, and our security. But not on my watch. Not on my watch. That won't work. I cannot stand by while this is done to America. She's done too much for me. Our nation, our values, and our people are strong, but our president is weak.
Yeah, I think that Mike Pence was going to try to be that candidate.
Think you're right.
Yeah. But I think that Tim Scott speaks to it better than Mike Pence does. And not that Mike Pence isn't, sincere about this. Mike Pence has spent his entire career talking about that and being that type of Republican. But I think Tim Scott is more inspirational along those lines. And I think his life is more inspirational along those lines, which is the reason why, even though I don't think he's got a realistic shot at breaking to the nomination, I'm glad he's in the race. And I also think of all the people in that race, he's the most likely to end up on the ticket.
Yeah, I think you're right. Mike Pence is your uptight Episcopalian deacon, whereas Tim Scott is your fiery, Methodist or Southern Baptist preacher. And we know what works better on the campaign trail. All right. So in our final minute here, Ed, does this make a difference? Do you see the numbers moving, or is this really just a prelude to the big kahuna coming up later this week?
Well, look, I mean, I think that the big kahuna is going to swamp this out a little bit, right? But I think Tim Scott's entry is significant, and not in a way that, Nikki Haley's wasn't really, in the way that Mike Pence's wasn't really. Even though all of these guys were expected to get in, Tim Scott really does offer something different. And it's not because he's the only Black Republican who's in this race. It's because he's the most optimistic, most energetic, most engaging candidate, a positively engaging candidate that we're going to see in this race. Ron DeSantis is great. He's a professional. He's going to run a professional campaign. Donald Trump is going to be Donald Trump. But I think that Tim Scott on the debate stage and Tim Scott on the campaign trail is really going to breathe some fresh life back into the Republican primary.
All right, I got to say it because he's a former Salem colleague. Larry Elder is also officially a declared candidate. He's Black. So there are two Black men running.
There are two Black Republicans, right?
Yes.
Right. As much as I love Larry, and I do love Larry, he's a great guy. I think Larry is in this less to be competitive, and I'm not knocking him on this, but more as a message guy. I mean, just the same way John Bolton was talking about getting into the race. John Bolton has a message. He's got an agenda he wants addressed in the primary. I think Larry's the same way.
I hear you.
Yeah.
Just trying to preempt all the comments we'll get. Hey, he's not the only Black Republican running. And once again, by the way, Ed, you forget my favorite candidate, Asa Hutchinson. We've got Asa fever here. There's more to come on O'Connor Tonight.